over the last 3 or more decades, particularly between the late 70s and 2008, the median wage, adjusted for inflation, barely increased at all. And yet the United States economy doubled in size. Therein lies, I think, a key to the problem. And it's something that even Keynesians, those who believe, as I do, that government has got to step up the plate and be the customer or consumer of last resort when regular consumers can't do it, even Keynesians are not adequately focusing on. What did Americans do when wages started flattening in the late 70s? Up to that point, from the end of the Second World War right into the late 70s, productivity improved and wages improved in tandem with productivity. The median wage went right up. Everybody shared in the spectacular growth of the economy. But beginning in the late 70s, when wages began to flatten, Americans continued to spend, but they could only spend by engaging in several coping mechanisms that are now exhausted. Coping mechanism number 1, women into paid work. Now, bear with me on this one, because poor women had been in paid work right along, and women had been working right along. But women in the late 70s and 80s and increasingly the 90s, wives and mothers, women went into paid work in extraordinary numbers, a great wave. And we had never seen anything like it in this country. And I wish I could tell you it was because of all the wondrous, wonderful professional opportunities open to women. But it was not. Women streamed into the workforce mainly to prop up family incomes that were being jeopardized because male wages were stagnating or declining. When that coping mechanism was exhausted, the second one was everybody working longer hours. By the 1990s, when I was labor secretary, I was amazed when I looked at the data. The number of hours the typical family was putting in, 300 hours more than the typical Japanese or European. I mean, we were working ourselves to the bone. It wasn't just hourly workers and wage workers, it was also professionals, billable hours, women and men. And then when that was exhausted, we moved to the final coping mechanism, and that was using homes as piggy banks, getting all of this money out of your home. And then the housing bubble burst, and that was the end of that. You see what I'm getting at? We have a deeper structural problem right now. That deeper structural problem is not just government is not capable or is spending enough to make up for consumers' unwillingness or inability to spend. The deeper structural problem is that wages are going nowhere. In fact, the median wage today is 8% below, adjusted for inflation, what it was in 2000. Politics comes from the Greek root poly, meaning many, and ticks, small blood-sucking insects. I don't really mean that, but that's certainly how it feels sometimes. It's not just Washington that's divided. This country is bitterly divided, and I think more divided than I remember. And part of the division is that we don't any longer talk to each other. That is, across the divide of ideology or party politics. It is so much easier today to live in places where the only people you come across are people who agree with you. But I tell my students at Berkeley something that I deeply believe, and that is the only way you learn anything in this life is to sit down and talk with somebody who disagrees with you. When I was a small boy, and I remember this very, very distinctly, my father, who was a staunch Republican and hated FDR, my father said to me, well, he's come a long way now, but he said to me, Bobby, you and your children and your children's children will be paying down the debt created by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, this was in the early 50s. I was 6 years old. I didn't know what a debt was, but I was scared. And I remember quite seriously, I had nightmares about the debt. I didn't know, this thing called the debt. It was this amorphous thing that would wreck my life and my children and my children's children's life. Well, interestingly, my father has not been wrong about many things, but he was absolutely wrong about this. What happened to the Franklin D. Roosevelt debt? In 1946, the debt was 120% of the entire national economy that year. Higher, much higher as a proportion of the economy than it is right now. What happened to that FDR debt? Why is it that the FDR debt is not still dogging me or my children or my grandchild? I have a 4-year-old grandchild. Not once has she mentioned Franklin D. Roosevelt and the debt he created. Well, was it because we stopped paying very much money? The government stopped. Well, no, because in the 50s, remember, we had a Korean War, we had a Cold War in the 60s, right through the 70s, the 80s. In the 1950s, we had a national highway building program. We rebuilt America. We rebuilt our educational system. We rebuilt Europe. We rebuilt Japan. It wasn't a matter of reducing government expenditures. What happened was the denominator of the equation, not the numerator, the denominator, growth. The size of the US economy exploded. We grew more than 3% a year. The problem, the central problem, the essential problem, aside from healthcare expenditures and baby boomers' healthcare needs in the future, another big problem is slow economic growth. That's what we have to tackle as well. The question is, are there ways of globalizing that don't harm developing nations, but at the same time don't harm us? It's not a zero-sum game in which they gain to the extent that we don't, or we gain to the extent that they don't gain. The global economy, properly organized, is a positive-sum game. We grow together. That's what happened in the first 3 decades after the Second World War. We can do it again. Now, how can we do it specifically? For example, suppose we had a rule that said to all of our trading partners, including us, that our minimum wage and your minimum wage has to be half your median wage. Well, what that would do is make sure that the gains from growth were widely distributed and widely spread, which would be good for them and good for us. I mean, most of the unemployment issue right now is due to inadequate aggregate demand. But there is undoubtedly some percentage of the unemployment problem that's due to a mismatch between what people looking for work can do and what employers need. And people often ask me, in fact, when I was labor secretary, I would hear this all the time, what are the jobs of the future? What should people be training for? And the answer is not ever clear, because most of the jobs of the future have not been created. That's why they're jobs of the future. But one thing we can know, and we can at least predict with some certitude, is that not every young person should have to go through one narrow gate called a 4-year college degree in order to make it in America. There ought to be other ways of doing it. And we know that one of the greatest shortages we have across the country, expressed in a variety of ways and shows up in a variety of indices, is a shortage of technicians, people who understand a particular domain of technology enough to be able to not only install it, but improve it, monitor it, repair it, and continue to improve upon it. Everywhere you look in this economy, you've got technical skills in short supply. And if we had a system of technical education that was anywhere like the extraordinarily well-developed system of technical education Germany has, we could have another route for our young people that would generate good jobs, well-paying jobs.